Hello and welcome to the On Server Newer Retreats YouTube channel. My name is Seamus. You are currently watching part 4 of a conversation that I had with Peter Taylor. And if you watch the other videos, you already know that by now. And if you watch the previous video, then you know that I already know that you know that by now. So without further ado, enjoy the final video. If you're working or you're at church and you hear something and it conflicts. So if you're at church and you hear something that conflicts with that's something that you know scientifically, or if you're working and it's conflicting with your faith or Christianity in general, how do you reconcile that? So we kind of touched on like the Genesis account earlier on, and I like the way you explained about how we're talking about agency versus mechanism, is that the way you generally go about it, or is there another way that you reconcile those two things? And if so, can you give us like an example maybe that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a couple of things to that. First of all, the agency mechanism perspective helps a lot with that. So that will certainly get you far. The other thing to understand is where there is a contradiction, it's usually on a peripheral issue. It's not usually one that's essentially important to Christian doctrine. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But maybe the simplest answer here is just understanding that the author of all truth is the same. So if there is some perceived contradiction, perceived being the crucial word, if there is a perceived contradiction between some empirical evidence from the scientific community and some biblical theme, then it's important to keep in mind that it's important to really, I would say, keep in mind that the laws of nature and the Bible have the same authorship. So there's not an actual contradiction.
Yeah.
It's just a perceived contradiction. And so the chances are it's just a shortfall in our understanding on one side or the other. Maybe the shortfall is on the scientific side, maybe it's on the biblical side. Maybe we're not really understanding what the author of that particular passage in the Bible was trying to communicate to us, for example. Or maybe something will change in how we understand something scientifically. So I see no actual contradictions, and we have to remember that our understanding on both sides is constantly evolving. Our understanding of scientific things is constantly evolving. For example, most of the scientific community once believed that the world existed forever. The universe was past eternal. And now most cosmologists don't think that, right? So it's constantly changing. So at one point, there would have been a perceived contradiction there. At one point, science would have said, or most scientists would have said, that the universe is past eternal, and Christians would have said, no, my Bible says it has a beginning.
Yeah.
But more evidence came along that actually suggested that the universe had a beginning, and now these two things align. So that's an example of and not being too dogmatic or too arrogant in your approach to these things, like remembering that these things are constantly evolving. Our understanding of scriptures is constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say, and this has really helped me a lot in my own study down through the years, for most things, there's very little room for conflict, right? Because of this agency mechanism thing. They're usually, science and faith are usually asking different questions. So for most things, there's very, very little room for conflict. If you do find a conflict, it's probably something peripheral, but if there is some area in which you feel like there is a conflict, you should at least try to understand the scriptures in the language in which it was written.
For sure, yeah.
And we have lots of tools to do that these days. Like for the first time in history, this is an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
Like, several hundred years ago, nobody had this luxury. But I can pull up an app on my phone now if I'm reading the Genesis account, and I can figure out exactly what was written in the original Hebrew.
Yeah.
I can figure out and I can probably better understand what the author's intent was. So, and the Genesis issue is famous among Christians, right? The timelines, for example, that the Bible, at least in its English version, seems to suggest a very young universe.
Yes.
Where science tells us the universe is whatever 13.8 billion years old or something like that. But when I read it in Hebrew, I feel like that issue just completely goes away. Right, the actual word for day there, for example, is the Hebrew word yom, which has a much broader meaning than our English word day. It can mean an unspecified period of time. It can mean a literal day. It can mean daylight. It can mean it can actually even mean an event or an act.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you can equally read that as, you know, God made the universe in 6 acts of creation,
Yeah, yeah,
6 phases of creation. That's a perfectly legitimate way to read that Genesis account.
yeah.
And so,
Go ahead.
yeah, so I was just going to say, I mean, for me, those conflicts just go away. They're not essentially important anyway to the Christian
Yes.
faith. So that's important also to keep in mind. But I just don't think they're even there when you
Yeah.
when you look back and read it in the Hebrew. So it's a non-issue for me.
Yeah, you're 100% right. Like the creativity, the creation account says, you know, on the third day that or on a particular day that the sun was created. How can you have a day? It wasn't the first day either. So how can you have a day
Yeah,
without the sun? So you're dead right.
yeah,
Like once you kind of I think the Bible, you need to, as you're reading it, you need to look, like you said, who's writing this? When are they writing it? Who are they writing it to? You know? And once you kind of
yeah.
start doing that, because I'm really interested in history, and even if you look at the prophets, when they're talking, the way they're talking about God is similar to how the
Mm,
kings at the time are talking as well. Even when
mm,
Paul is talking about certain things, he's talking,
mm.
and I think that I think the Bible was maybe written in a way like that, so we would pursue our interests more. Do you know? It's like, okay, here's this outline, and if you want to know more, you can, and it's
Yeah,
fascinating. But if you don't, if it's fine for you, you don't need to know more as well.
yeah, and I think I think one of the things that people err in is in how they visualize the idea that the Bible is inspired by God. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that all Christians believe. We believe the Bible is inspired by God. But I think what some people visualize by that is that God takes over the body of a person, and you know that their own mind, their own experiences, their own will isn't active in that process.
Yeah.
And that's a mistake. It's a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a mistake. And people are writing and that no way that in no way takes away from the
For sure.
inspired
Yeah.
nature of the book. And God, one of the proofs to me that God is willing to reveal himself by using lower forms is the fact that Jesus came as man,
Mm-hmm.
right? Man, a lower form,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So God is not afraid to use lower forms to reveal his nature. And I see that all throughout scripture as well. And I have no problem holding in one hand the inspired nature of every piece of scripture and the fact that it genuinely involved people in space time, in history,
Yes.
broken people,
Mm-hmm.
flawed people. Like I don't that to me, there's no contradiction there to me. That to me is completely consistent with everything else I know about God, that he's not afraid to use these lower forms to reveal his higher nature. And to me, Jesus is evidence of that. Um, and I love this quote actually. There's a great quote by this Irish scientist, Robert Boyle. So you might know Robert Boyle. He's one of the kind of laid the foundations of modern chemistry, most famous for
Mm-hmm.
Boyle's law. We all learned in school. Great Irish scientist. But he said, but the two great books of nature and of scripture have the same author. So the study of the latter does not at all hinder an inquisitive man's delight in the study of the former. And I just think that's a really beautiful way of capturing that
Yeah.
idea that really two books. There is the law of nature and there's scriptures, and there's no contradiction because they have the same author, and we can delight in both. And I
I
really
think
think
that
that's a
quote is the
message.
perfect way to end the conversation. Really well. I think it kind of sums up everything that you've been saying, you know, and kind of questions I was asking as well. The way you answered them kind of answers in that way. So,
Mm.
Peter, thanks a million again for all of your time and all of your effort to meet up and to give us your opinions in that. And just wanted to thank you so much.
Yeah, best of luck, Seamus. Really appreciate it, and yeah, it was my
Cheers.
privilege.
There you have it, guys. That's the entire conversation that I had with Peter. And like I mentioned previously, I really had an enjoyable time making these videos. I even enjoyed rewatching them again. I found what he said very insightful, and I really liked how his passion came through. So the reason I put these videos up is twofold. One is to see this idea of how faith and science can work hand in hand, and they don't have to be in massive conflict with each other. And it was better to hear that from a scientist than hearing that from me. And the other reason was I wanted people to see like how he began and how he became who he is today. He started off getting involved in the BT Young Scientists. It seemed like such a small, maybe insignificant step, but I really like that because we talk to students a lot about purpose, and exploring your interests is a massive way of pursuing a purpose in your life. So if you're watching this video, maybe you're not into astrophysics, but I encourage you to find out what you are interested in. Get involved in the competition. Put yourself out there. Join a club or a community, because you have no idea what it might spark in you. You have no idea where you might end up being because of that first step that you took. So guys, again, I hope you really enjoyed the videos, and the next video we have will be coming out shortly. It's long.